Hello students, Professor Piggy here. Today we are going to feast upon the rich and satisfying topic of risk, and we will do so with the precision required for your cybersecurity exam. Risk is the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability, resulting in a negative impact to an organization. A vulnerability is a weakness in software, hardware, or a process, and a threat is any potential danger that could take advantage of that weakness. When the wolf finds a cracked door and decides to push, that push and the damage that follows is the realization of risk. When evaluating risk, we always examine two major criteria: impact and likelihood. Impact is the magnitude of harm that would result if a threat successfully exploits a vulnerability. Likelihood, also called probability, is the chance that this exploitation will occur. On your exam, remember that risk is not just danger by itself, and it is not just weakness by itself, but the combination of likelihood and impact together. Consider a system without up-to-date antivirus software. The missing protection is the vulnerability, and malware created by malicious attackers is the threat. The risk is the likelihood that the malware will reach and infect that vulnerable system, causing harm such as data loss, system failure, or widespread infection. If the system is isolated with no internet, no network, and no removable media, the likelihood is very low, but once connected to the internet and used carelessly, the wolf begins circling with much greater enthusiasm. It is critical to understand that you cannot eliminate risk entirely. You could unplug every device and bury it in the mud, but then you would have no business operations and no delicious digital productivity. Instead, organizations practice risk management, which is the process of identifying, analyzing, monitoring, and limiting risks to a manageable level. Risk management reduces risk to an acceptable level, but it never reduces it to zero. Threats come in several forms, and you must know these categories clearly. Malicious human threats include attackers ranging from unskilled individuals to organized crime groups and advanced persistent threats sponsored by governments. Accidental human threats occur when users or administrators unintentionally delete data, misconfigure systems, or cause outages. Environmental threats include natural disasters such as floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and long-term power failures that can disrupt operations and damage infrastructure. A threat assessment identifies and categorizes threats that could affect an organization's assets. It attempts to estimate both the likelihood and the potential impact of each threat. Once identified, threats are prioritized so that the most serious risks receive attention first. This structured approach ensures that security controls are aligned with the most significant dangers rather than chosen at random. Risk identification is an early step in risk management and involves gathering information from many sources to list possible risks. Security professionals use tools such as vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, audits, and threat intelligence to identify weaknesses and exposures. The goal is to develop a comprehensive view of what could go wrong. The more clearly the barn is inspected, the harder it is for the wolf to sneak inside unnoticed. Risks can also be categorized by type. Internal risks originate within the organization and include employees, hardware, and software under organizational control. External risks originate outside the organization and include attackers and natural disasters. Other categories include intellectual property theft, software licensing compliance issues, and legacy systems that are no longer supported by vendors and therefore no longer receive security patches. A vulnerability is a flaw or weakness that a threat can exploit. Examples include default configurations, weak or missing patch management, lack of firewalls, outdated malware definitions, and absence of organizational policies, such as least privilege or job rotation. Not every vulnerability is exploited, but the presence of a vulnerability means the potential for exploitation exists. The fact that the wolf has not yet blown on the door does not mean the door is strong. Risk management includes several important concepts. Inherent risk is the level of risk before any controls are applied. Residual risk is the remaining risk after controls are implemented. Control risk refers to the possibility that existing controls are insufficient or fail to operate effectively, and senior management is responsible for accepting residual risk based on organizational objectives. Organizations also define risk appetite and risk tolerance. Risk appetite is the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals. Risk tolerance is the organization's ability to withstand the consequences if a risk materializes. The risk threshold is the level of risk that must be reached before the organization acts. An organization with significant financial reserves may tolerate more financial risk than one operating on thin margins. There are 4 primary risk management strategies you must memorize. Risk avoidance means eliminating the activity that creates the risk. Risk mitigation means implementing controls to reduce likelihood or impact. Risk acceptance means acknowledging the risk and choosing not to implement additional controls because the cost exceeds the benefit. When accepting risk, the organization may need to obtain an exemption or exception to policies, laws, or regulations. Risk transference means shifting the financial impact of the risk to another party, commonly through insurance. A risk assessment, also called risk analysis, evaluates and prioritizes risks. It begins by identifying assets and determining asset value, often expressed as a monetary amount. It then identifies threats and vulnerabilities and estimates both likelihood and impact. The final output includes recommended controls and helps management make informed decisions. Risk assessments can be performed as one-time or ad hoc, on a recurring basis, or as a continuous process. Quantitative risk assessment uses monetary values to measure risk. The asset value represents the cost of replacing or restoring an asset. The exposure factor is the percentage of asset loss if a risk occurs. The single loss expectancy is calculated as asset value multiplied by exposure factor, and the annualized loss expectancy is calculated as single loss expectancy multiplied by the annualized rate of occurrence. The annualized rate of occurrence represents how often a risk is expected to occur per year. When you multiply single loss expectancy by annualized rate of occurrence, you obtain the annualized loss expectancy, which estimates the expected yearly cost of a risk. This calculation allows management to compare the cost of controls with the expected annual loss. If a control costs less than the reduction in annualized loss expectancy, it is financially justified. Qualitative risk assessment, by contrast, uses judgment rather than exact monetary values. Risks are categorized using terms such as low, medium, and high for likelihood and impact. These categories may be assigned numerical values to assist in prioritization, but they are still based on expert judgment rather than precise financial data. This approach is useful when exact data is unavailable or when measuring intangible impacts, such as reputational damage. Risk reporting documents the identified risks and recommended controls. These reports are sensitive because they contain detailed information about vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Access is typically restricted to executive management and security professionals. If such a report fell into the wolf's paws, it would provide a convenient roadmap for exploitation. Organizations often maintain a risk register, which is a living document listing identified risks, their likelihood, impact, assigned risk owners, and current status. A risk matrix may also be used to visually plot likelihood against impact. Key risk indicators are measurable metrics used to monitor changes in risk levels over time. These tools support continuous awareness and proactive management of evolving threats. Finally, consider supply chain risk. A supply chain includes all elements required to produce and deliver a product or service, including third-party vendors. If an attacker compromises a supplier, the organization may be affected indirectly. Supply chain attacks exploit trust relationships, so organizations reduce this risk by assessing vendors, monitoring for disruptions, and, when possible, maintaining alternate sources. Remember, dear students, risk cannot be eliminated, but it can be understood, measured, and managed with discipline and intelligence. On your exam, define terms precisely, distinguish between likelihood and impact, and know the formulas for quantitative analysis. Outsmart the wolf. By thinking systematically, applying controls wisely, and always aligning security decisions with business objectives. If this lesson strengthened your snout for sniffing out exam questions, be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next lecture. Oink.